You didn't wake up the way stories usually describe awakening. There was no moment where everything suddenly became clear, no sharp realization that split your life into before and after. It happened quietly, so quietly that for a long time you didn't even recognize it as something meaningful. At first, it felt like a mild discomfort you couldn't explain, a subtle sense that something around you wasn't fully aligned. Life continued normally on the surface. People followed routines, conversations sounded familiar, days passed as expected, and yet something inside you remained alert. You noticed small things before they felt important, how easily people accepted explanations without questioning them, how confidently opinions were repeated even when no one could trace where they came from, how certain people sounded about ideas they had never truly examined. This didn't make you feel smarter. It didn't make you feel special. It made you feel observant. You began to sense that many beliefs weren't chosen. They were inherited, passed down through repetition, social reward, and the quiet pressure to belong. Most people didn't stop to ask whether something was true. They stopped as soon as something felt familiar. Your mind didn't stop there. When an answer appeared, you felt the urge to look behind it, to ask how it formed, who benefited from it, what it conveniently ignored. At first, this curiosity felt natural, harmless, even invisible, but over time it began to change how you experienced the world. You started feeling slightly out of rhythm with others, not disconnected, just misaligned. Like you were standing half a step behind the moment, watching it instead of dissolving into it. People around you seemed settled, comfortable inside routines, certain in ways that didn't require revisiting. You weren't unsettled. You weren't anxious. You were awake. And wakefulness didn't arrive as clarity. It arrived as awareness that refused to go back to sleep. That was the beginning, not of rebellion, not of isolation, but of quiet separation. Psychological sleep has nothing to do with intelligence. It isn't a lack of ability, and it isn't weakness. Most people who are asleep are fully capable of understanding more. They simply don't need to. Sleep is efficiency. It allows the mind to move through the world with minimal resistance. It reduces complexity into familiar shapes. It turns uncertainty into something manageable, something repeatable. For most people, this isn't a conscious choice. It's something they absorb early, long before they're able to question it. They learn which questions slow conversations down, which observations create tension, which thoughts make others uncomfortable. Slowly, without being told directly, they learn what to ignore. Sleep becomes a quiet agreement with the world. Don't look too closely, and things will remain stable. Beliefs don't need to be traced back to their origin. Opinions don't need to be tested. Explanations don't need to be complete, as long as they feel satisfying. This is how psychological sleep maintains itself, not through ignorance, but through comfort. Your mind doesn't follow this pattern. When an answer is given, you don't relax into it. You feel a pull to examine it, to ask where it came from, why it exists in that form, what purpose it serves beyond sounding reasonable. This doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like unfinished business. You notice that many explanations are designed to end curiosity, not encourage it. They close the loop quickly, so life can continue uninterrupted, so routines remain intact, so identity stays stable. But your awareness resists closure. You sense when a conclusion arrives too easily, when certainty appears too quickly, when confidence replaces understanding. And in those moments, you don't feel superior. You feel awake in a room where others have already decided to rest. That's when separation deepens, not outwardly, but internally. Because psychological sleep isn't about not knowing. It's about choosing not to stay with discomfort. And you've already learned how to stay.
Awareness doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as friction. At first, you don't understand why certain interactions feel slightly off. Nothing is openly wrong. Conversations continue, people smile, social rhythms remain intact. And yet, something doesn't settle. You begin to notice how quickly people move towards certainty, how often emotions are expressed to signal belonging rather than truth, how silence is treated as something that must be filled, even when nothing meaningful needs to be said. These observations don't come with judgment. They arrive quietly, almost accidentally. You notice them the same way you notice a repeating sound in the background, not immediately, but eventually. As this awareness grows, your internal pace starts to shift. You no longer respond automatically. You pause before agreeing. You hesitate before mirroring emotion. Not because you want to disrupt anything, but because you're no longer fully inside the rhythm everyone else is moving to. This pause changes how people experience you. They don't sense rejection, they sense misalignment. You're still present, still listening, still engaged, but your responses don't always reinforce the shared emotional flow. When certainty is expected, you offer nuance. When reassurance is assumed, you offer silence. When reaction is demanded, you offer observation. Nothing dramatic happens, no confrontation, no exclusion, just a subtle shift. Conversations begin to stay on safer ground. Topics change before they deepen. Moments that could open into something meaningful quietly close instead. You feel this change not as loss, but as distance, a growing sense that you're standing slightly outside the center of things, close enough to see clearly, far enough to feel separate. And this is when awareness reveals its first cost. Before it brings meaning, it creates space. There is a moment when awareness stops feeling like insight and starts feeling like weight. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It happens quietly, as your mind begins to notice what others move past without friction. You start seeing how much of life depends on not looking too closely, how comfort is maintained through assumptions, how stability is built on unexamined habits, inherited beliefs, and repeated stories people tell themselves until they feel true. Once you're awake, those stories lose their grip. You notice how often people confuse certainty with truth, how strongly they defend opinions they've never tested, how quickly discomfort is labeled as negativity, overthinking, or pessimism, anything to avoid sitting with it. This is the cost of clarity. You can no longer unsee the shortcuts. You begin to realize that many people aren't living deliberately. They're following scripts, social scripts, emotional scripts, cultural scripts, patterns learned early and rarely questioned. And questioning those patterns, even silently, separates you, not because you announce it, not because you argue, but because your reactions slow down. You pause where others rush to agreement. You hesitate where others repeat what's expected. You think where others perform. That pause alone is enough to mark you as different. Awareness creates distance not by intention, but by consequence. You stop responding automatically. You stop being emotionally efficient. You stop offering simple reactions to complex realities. And most social systems depend on simplicity. They need quick validation, clear sides, predictable responses. When you don't provide those, friction appears. Not loud friction, subtle friction. People feel unsettled around you without knowing why. They sense that you're not fully playing the same game, even if you're polite, calm, and engaged. You're present, but not absorbed, attentive, but not attached. And attachment is what most relationships quietly rely on. The more clearly you see how much of human behavior is driven by fear, fear of exclusion, fear of meaninglessness, fear of being wrong, the harder it becomes to participate without restraint. You understand too much to react blindly. You anticipate emotional outcomes before they arrive. You see conflicts forming before words sharpen. So you pull back, not in anger, not in superiority, but in self-protection. Because once you understand how fragile most identities are, you realize how dangerous honesty can feel to them. And so awareness asks for a price. It costs you immediacy. It costs you innocence. It costs you the comfort of believing that closeness always means understanding. You become someone who knows why things happen, but rarely feels surprised by them. And while that knowledge offers control, it quietly takes something else in return: lightness. You're not unhappy, but you're rarely unburdened. You don't suffer dramatically, but you carry more than you share. This is the trade-off few talk about. Awakening doesn't elevate you above others, it places you slightly apart, watching a world that functions smoothly precisely because it doesn't stop to question itself. And once you see that, you understand something unsettling. Awareness doesn't make life easier, it makes it honest. And honesty without illusion is heavy.
Awareness is often described as freedom, but in reality it feels more like exposure. To be awake is to notice what comfort tries to hide, to see the cracks beneath routines, to recognize how much of daily life is built to distract rather than resolve. Most people don't avoid awareness because they're incapable of it. They avoid it because it disrupts too much at once. Waking up questions identities. It destabilizes beliefs that have provided structure for years. It forces responsibility where habit once existed. And responsibility is heavy. For many, it's easier to believe that things are the way they are for a reason, that effort will be rewarded, that people are mostly rational, that life follows some moral symmetry. Awareness doesn't offer those comforts. It shows randomness, contradiction, systems that benefit from confusion rather than clarity. So people resist, not consciously, not maliciously. They scroll, they joke, they repeat phrases that feel true because they're familiar. Distraction isn't laziness, it's protection. To stay asleep is to preserve emotional balance, to avoid the discomfort of unresolved questions, to keep functioning without constantly reevaluating the ground beneath you. And society quietly rewards this. Those who don't question too deeply fit in more easily. They adapt faster. They move smoothly through institutions designed for compliance, not reflection. Waking up, by contrast, slows you down. You hesitate before accepting explanations. You look for incentives behind narratives. You feel the tension between what's said and what's real. That tension doesn't disappear. It follows you into conversations, into work, into relationships, and people feel it. They sense that you're not fully aligned with the shared agreement to keep things uncomplicated. So they push back, not with arguments, but with discomfort. They label awareness as negativity, depth as overthinking, silence as detachment. These labels aren't meant to understand you. They're meant to return equilibrium. Because awareness threatens stability, not just personal stability, but collective stability. A world where too many people wake up is harder to manage, harder to predict, harder to soothe with surface-level solutions. So sleep becomes cultural. Busyness replaces presence, entertainment replaces meaning, confidence replaces understanding, and those who remain awake start to feel out of place, not because they reject the world, but because the world quietly rejects what they represent. Awareness removes you from the comfort of belonging by default. It asks you to stand without constant reassurance. And that's why most people resist waking up. Not because they don't want truth, but because truth asks for a level of courage most systems don't support. So they stay asleep, and the awake learn to live quietly among them. Loneliness doesn't arrive because something went wrong. It arrives because something changed. You didn't lose people. You lost the ability to pretend that closeness was automatic. Once you become aware, social interaction shifts.
You notice when conversations are driven by habit instead of curiosity, when emotions are expressed for validation rather than understanding. This awareness doesn't make you antisocial, it makes you selective without trying to be. You begin to feel tired after interactions that once felt neutral, not because they're hostile, but because they're hollow. You listen more than you speak, and when you do speak, you notice how quickly depth is redirected into comfort. So you pull back, not to punish others, not to elevate yourself, but because constant translation is exhausting. Isolation becomes a side effect of refusing to reduce your inner life to something easily consumable. You realize that many relationships are built on rhythm, not resonance, on frequency, not alignment. They survive through repetition, through shared schedules, routines, and distractions. Awareness disrupts that rhythm. You no longer sync automatically. You pause, you question, you reflect, and in doing so, you step slightly out of tempo. People don't always notice why you feel distant. They just feel that something is different. You're quieter, less reactive, harder to read, not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer projecting constantly. This creates space, not empty space, unshared space. You find yourself alone in rooms that are full, present in conversations that don't reach you, and eventually you stop forcing yourself to stay. Isolation at this point isn't rejection, it's consequence. The consequence of awareness in environments optimized for speed, certainty, and emotional shortcuts. You're isolated not because you're incapable of connection. You're isolated because connection now requires compatibility at a deeper level, and that level is rare. So solitude becomes familiar, not always comfortable, not always chosen, but honest. You stop blaming yourself for it. You stop interpreting loneliness as proof that something is missing. Instead, you see it for what it is, a signal that your internal pace no longer matches the external world. Isolation isn't the opposite of connection. It's what remains when connection stops being performative. And while that space can feel quiet, it's also where clarity settles. You're alone not because you failed. You're alone because you woke up. And waking up changes who can walk beside you.